Welcome back to Biblical Questions Answered, Episode 4. Today's question is the King James Version inspired? Which is not an easy question. Well, it is an easy question to answer, but it's a difficult question. It's a difficult claim to respond to if someone believes it, because it's a spiritual matter. It's like trying to argue with someone who's claimed a spiritual revelation. It's their experience. And there's not a good way. Logic doesn't necessarily work with those kinds of people. So, what is the King James Version? Well, the King James Version was created, translated, and published in 1611 by King James of England. And there were many things that happened in the King James Version translation process. One of the things that they did was they separated them into groups. They would have certain people translate the Gospel, and then another group would translate the works of Paul, and then another group would translate something like Revelation. And when they did that, they ended up with some inconsistencies in the translation, because some people would translate a word one way and another group would translate another word another way. Now, another issue with it is one of their sources was Erasmus and his Greek texts, which he had some issues with Revelation. Long story short, he was missing the last 6 verses of Revelation in Greek. And it was difficult enough to get the verses he had of Revelation. And so what he had to do, in the end, was to take the Latin Vulgate and translate those verses from Latin into Greek the best he could. And I suppose he did a good job. He only had 17 variations in the 6 verses that you won't find anywhere in the rest of any other translation, any other copy of the Greek in history, right, that we have. So that was an issue, And of course, even if the 1611 was inspired, nobody has the 1611 King James Version. Nobody. Now, you may go up to somebody and they may not even realize that. You see, overwhelming chances are that what they have is the 1769 revision, which has thousands of differences between it and the King James Version 1611. And that would be a good talking point to bring up, because, well, is your version the one that's inspired, or is the one that they wrote in 1611 the one that's inspired? Or is it the other revision that happened in the 1800s? I believe it's a revision was what happened in the 1800s. Other things you could use, you could mention Matthew 20 through 24, which has the Pharisees straining at a gnat versus straining out a gnat, which is what the Greek clearly says, and you'll actually have some King James Version only people agreeing with that, which is interesting. You also have, if someone says, well, you can't understand the King James Version because you're not spiritual enough. Well, funnily enough, when it was published, people were actually somewhat upset because it was too easy to understand. Now, I guess the last thing that I would point out, which I'm sure there are many things to point out, but the last thing I would point out is that the names make no sense. It's not like the newer versions do any better, and it's tradition, and, it's like, people know what you're talking about when you say the Book of James, the Epistle of James. They wouldn't know what you were talking about if you said the Epistle of Jacob. I mean, that would be the proper way to translate it, but tradition is tradition. And yes, if you were translating things consistently, there wouldn't be a difference between Jesus and Joshua because it's the same name. So, why do we translate it Jesus? It pretty much is just tradition, right? Nobody in Jesus' day called him Jesus. They would have called him, if they were speaking in Greek, they would have called him Yesu. Chances are it was probably closer to something like Yeshua. In fact, Messianic Jews call him that. So why do we not translate it Joshua? Just tradition. But why would they believe the Holy Spirit would have them call Jesus something that he was never called when he was alive? So those are just a few arguments that you could make. My answer is no, but there's nothing I can do to convince someone who believes otherwise, because it's their experience. So next time, I will be beginning the long process of going through the book of Genesis, which the first chapter will probably have 10, 15 episodes, all based on it. Maybe not that much. It could end up being that many. So yes, until next time, I'll think of a good ending line at a later date. Goodbye. See you later.